Look, I'll start talking and we'll see if we can get this going. So my name's Ben West. I'm a stonemason, which currently that means I'm the director of a stonemasonry company. And we work sort of broadly right across the country, mostly based in Canterbury, and really working both on new buildings and on sort of historic structures. At the moment, for example, I've got people working over here at the Cathedral. My background, which is what I'll talk about initially and sort of how I got into it, I'm a third generation stonemason. My father emigrated to New Zealand in the late 70s and began work here. He's actually worked for the Department of Conservation as a stonemason and then more broadly as a ranger, sort of helping in conserving some of our built history. And so for me, that was kind of growing up with a father. That's all good. That's cool. In that field, I sort of got to go out and experience all these things. And really the outtake from me was that I didn't want to be a stonemason. So it's quite interesting that I've ended up doing it. So I sort of grew up working with him and initially helping just in school holidays. Some of the more interesting things that I did, I worked up in the Huranui Hotel where we went up for one weekend just to rebuild the back wall of a hotel kitchen. It was an old historic building so that they could stay in business. I've also worked over on Rapapa Island, which is an old fort really, for want of a better term, in Littleton Harbour. Not very many people know about it, but it's an amazing piece of history. I worked there for a whole summer conserving the sea walls there, restoring them. It takes the full brunt of the easterly and was in a pretty sorry state, and we actually lived in the old jail on the island for a week at a time. So we lived in the cells, sounds more grim than it was, and then just worked doing that. So then by the time I finished school, I was fairly keen not to be a stonemason. I was actually signed up to do landscape architecture at Lincoln University, and having just about been ready to start that, it was just when they introduced student loans at that point, and it was the first sort of fee-paying education, and I guess that just, I was a little bit nervous about the debt I was going to get into and wasn't quite sure that it was what I wanted to do. So I travelled at that point, and it was really when I got overseas that I realised the sort of variety of work that was actually available to me as a stonemason. I'd effectively served my apprenticeship by that time, and I worked in the west of Scotland initially. One of the key projects up there was restoring or converting an old steading, an old mill into a house, which was pretty interesting. The Highland clearances had taken a lot of people out of the west of Scotland, and a lot of buildings were being converted back to housing, try to bring people back in. And that was a really interesting project. It was pretty rudimentary stonework, very agricultural. And I moved from there to central London, and that really opened my eyes to sort of what was available. I got to work on some really interesting projects there. I worked there for about 5 years. And I got put through a qualification while I was there by the firm I was working with, but it was really a retrospective qualification in so much as that I was already doing the work at the point that they put us through. And I got to work on some really interesting buildings there. The Treasury, for example, which is right next to Downing Street, is a massive, massive restoration. We were in there for over a year. Public Records Office in Chancery Lane, where my first job was sort of pinning big ears on gargoyles, which are those amazing sort of creatures, mythical creatures that project out from buildings. And really just a really broad range of structure and things. I really would have liked to stay there. I was in a good firm and sort of working my way up. My wife was Danish and wanted to either move back to Denmark or back to New Zealand, and my father wanted to retire and had sort of suggested that I come back and help him with sort of winding down the company. So I moved back here in 2005 and really thought that would be the end of sort of working on much sort of significant historical structure. Probably had sort of missed the point a little bit about how much we actually had here in New Zealand. And, you know, since going back to Europe, I mean, of course they have much more, but we have a massive amount of amazing buildings here. And I had the privilege of working on some really stunning buildings in Christchurch and in Wellington, and just on structure all around the city here. So that's really my background. I mean, I have two qualifications. They're both trade-based. it is fundamentally learning on the job. There's certainly skills that you would be useful from academic degrees, and from time to time I wish that I did architecture or engineering just to sort of understand a little bit more what I'm actually doing. But in terms of the trade-based background, really learning on these buildings that have all been built in different times by different people in a different manner, there's really not a lot of teaching that you have the tool skills, but you really need to bring the knowledge of identifying what you're looking at, of understanding and working through the trade sort of side of it. And that for us is kind of investigating the building initially, which sometimes it brings me in here to the library, to the rare books section. Sometimes it drives me to the internet, talking to people, some of the people you've heard from earlier today, finding old resource that I might have, cuttings. Yeah, I mean, there's a real range of getting information. And these buildings, the history of them is not particularly well documented in many cases. What's happened to them from a construction point of view, usually almost no documentation. I mean, you've heard a lot today about the history and why buildings are built and all the rest of it, but the physical part of it, really for us, it's a massive investigation initially, trying to work out what the materials are, where we can get them, how to fix them. Some are conserved, some actually can be restored. Because in New Zealand we have a very, very strict building code, which is obviously around the earthquakes, which, as you can see, are capable of doing a lot of damage. It's not always practical to actually work with the condition of some of this fabric, so we have to go out and find where that material came from. For example, I'll talk through a project that we worked here. So the Canterbury Provincial Chambers, which is a building just down at the far end of Gloucester Street. Unfortunately in a pretty sorry state at the moment, but we were quite privileged to work on that in 2009, conserving the south window of the stone chamber. And that was built from a stone that comes from just a very small part of a quarry in Littleton. It was very, very hard to find matching material, and we needed a block about the size of this lectern. And we had to start with a block about, I guess it was 5 metres long, 1 metre square, probably weighed about 3 or 4 tonne. We had to bring that back to our yard and actually split it down until it was a block, again around the size of the lectern. Just work that through until it was square. Remove the piece of the old building, which was a sort of decorative capital. So that's like a sort of flowery piece of stonework that sits at the top of a column. We then had to work and carve that back from what it was. Replicated, I guess, is the best way to describe it. The old one was completely sheaving off, and because it's an actual structural piece of stone, it was no longer doing its job. And we had to get that carved right through, bring it up onto the building, install it into the building. And that's quite rewarding, to actually take something from its sort of raw material, to actually go out and find it in nature and bring it right through to something refined that will be there for, well, the hope was that it would be there for a long, long time. Unfortunately, during the earthquake, it fell down probably the year after. But the nice thing for a lot of the work that we do is that we get to work on things that will be there a long, long time. I've got a father in his mid-80s, and I know he gets a huge amount of satisfaction wandering around in town, or even just in Kashmir or somewhere like that, and just seeing all the things that he's worked on. So for us, the things that we sort of look for in people is, I guess, being able to do things practically. I mean, you do have to have dexterity and sort of hand skills and coordination and all those things, but it's also an appreciation of the visual beauty of something. And the reason I say that is lots of trades are based very much on sort of functionally installing things, making sure that they technically work very well. In stonework, a lot of it has to look right, and generally stone has been used, while this building, for example, that you see across the road there is built of stone, a lot of what you're actually seeing has been done in a way that it's attractive and it's interesting to look at, and yes, there is form to that function as well, but really getting things looking right, and that's the sort of thing that we sort of struggle sometimes to convey to people, is that when you start, you're not going to be able to just go and work on something amazing, and just to get the appreciation of even just doing the small things. I mean, I've had jobs where we literally just have to restore an old stone fence post or something, and it can take 2 or 3 days, but it's equally rewarding. I guess the other thing to sort of think about, and what I did, which was travelling and going and exploring and finding stonework to do all around the world, when you take on a trade, which is what I'm talking about, you can travel with it. It does lead to lots of opportunities. I've worked in 3 countries with my trade, and I could work in many more. And I think the interest in that is that each place is different. I have some French staff who work with us. We've had people seconded to us from other countries. And you really get to explore and go and see these things. I mean, the first thing that I'll go and do when I arrive in a new city is go and have a look and see what the stonework is. And it really does vary. Even within New Zealand, if you go each part of the country, different quarries, different types of buildings because of it, and different structure. That's probably about as much as I can. As I say, it's a shame I couldn't bring the photos through, but apologies for that. And yeah, cool. Thank you.